Hi, this is Shannon McNulty. Welcome to the Global Village Law and Money podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Steve Maggi, and today we're going to be talking about U.S. gift and estate taxes and what you need to know about this type of tax and how you can make sure or try to make sure that you avoid or minimize the taxes as much as necessary.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. I love co-hosting this show, and I think everyone that I work with on my side is going to be interested in this information because these are concepts that don't necessarily translate to the countries that they come from or they're coming from. And people don't realize that, right? Every country has a different system on a tax level, on a trust and estates level, the codes and the laws are all very different. So it's really important for people to understand this so they can protect their assets and better plan. And even when they're in the US, better plan starting today for tomorrow,
Yes, absolutely. And these taxes, a lot of times maybe people are talking about or they are aware of income taxes, and that's what they think about when they think about taxes and whether they have to pay taxes as a resident. And there's a whole, as a US resident, and there's a whole test of different factors of what goes into that. But the estate tax is really different. And so even though you may not be a US resident for income tax purposes, you may be for estate tax purposes, and the vice versa. You may be a US income tax resident, but not a resident for US estate tax purposes. And also there may be treaties that apply to income taxes for your country, but not to estate taxes. So this is an area where there's definitely a lot of confusion, and it's also a trap for the unwary because this can be really draconian in some situations. So it's important to kind of understand how it works and where you can fall into some pitfalls and have a pretty bad outcome for your family.
Which I think feeds into that first question that I was going to ask you today. The pitfalls are what we're trying to avoid, right? So that's one of the reasons I'm imagining that it's important for our listeners to know what US gift and estate taxes are. And maybe you could just explain a little bit, because I think people think, oh, I got a gift for my birthday or I got a gift for Christmas, and why should there be anything related to taxes? It's much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, when we're talking about gifts or estates, often it's called a transfer tax. And so it is really anytime money is transferred from one person to another. That's when this tax can come into play.
Wow. Okay. So it's not here's a new iPhone. It's here's $100,000 that I'm gifting to you that will now essentially pertain to you and be under your control and possession.
Yes, and quite, like the iPhone is probably, we don't have to worry too much about the iPhone, but anything that is over, really, now that we're looking at like $15,000, $17,000. So it doesn't even have to be like really large. I mean, that's all relative here, but it doesn't have to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. That it can come into effect even when you have some smaller amounts. So I think the first thing is to just kind of understand the broad framework of how these taxes work, and then we could talk a little bit about how it breaks down depending on what your visa status is and how it plays into immigration as well.
What about just the word estate? Like, well, what does that mean? That's not a word that translates well to other legal systems. What does that mean in the US legal context?
Sure. An estate is what you leave behind when you pass away. So all of your assets is what your estate is, and when it's going to somebody else. So you no longer own it because you're not there anymore. And so that is the estate. And the estate administration process is the process of transferring those assets to whoever it is who's inheriting them.
Got it. Yeah, and I'm sure we could do a whole other podcast about jurisdictional issues, because I'm fascinated with my clients who have a residence in another country, born in another country, but then depending on whether they're green card holders or they're dual citizens or they're here temporarily on different visas, this probably also has a shift dynamic to it as well, and also probably the state where they're residing. So
yes, all of that comes into play. So estate taxes apply when you pass away, and then there can be a tax on the transfer from your name to the name of your heirs. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about estate taxes.
got it. Okay, so that, I guess that leads me into the next question, and I'm sure this is based on circumstances, but who's the person paying these gift and estate taxes? If the person who has an estate passes away, then they can't pay their taxes, right? Because they're no longer with us. So how does that work?
Yeah, so technically the estate pays the taxes, but for kind of all intents and purposes, that's really the beneficiaries, whoever is inheriting it. But the estate itself is who is liable primarily for the taxes. And why that's important is that if you're the executor of an estate, you're responsible for making sure that those taxes are paid before before any distributions go out. And if you have an account with a financial institution, they may hold it back until they get clearance from the IRS that everything is okay, so that they can distribute the money and make sure that they're not going to be on the hook, because in some cases the financial institution can be on the hook if they distribute money out as part of an estate, and that beneficiary, that there was the appropriate estate tax weren't paid.
Does the gift, since we're talking also about gift taxes, is that only something that applies when someone is alive and they're gifting money to someone, or does it also apply in posthumous situations as well?
Yeah, so gifts only apply while you're alive.
Okay.
However, the gift and estate tax often work together in tandem. So, for example, and we'll use a scenario of just a US person, because just to make things simple, the estate tax exemption currently at the federal level is about almost $13 million right now. So it's really high by historical standards, and even under current law, that's going to go down to around 6 million at the end of 2025. So many, I hate to get into the weeds.
That's a huge drop. That's more than 50%. That means that they're probably quadrupling their pool of potentially taxable estates, right?
At least, because it kind of exponentially decreases,
exactly.
As you go up. So the estate is, if you have assets that are over that, we'll say $13 million when you pass away, then there's going to be a tax on any amount that's over that threshold.
Makes sense.
Okay, so if the estate tax exemption is 13 million and you have 14 million, then there's going to be a 40% tax on that 1 million.
Got it. Right. It's what's left over, I guess, what the difference is.
Yeah.
And in terms of the gift, you said sometimes they overlap. Does that mean, let's say a gift was given, but then someone passes away, and so it sort of rolls over into the estate part of the tax?
Kind of. So that exemption, whether it be 13 million or 6 million, that's a lifetime exemption. So we refer to it often as an estate tax exemption, but it's really a lifetime transfer exemption.
Okay.
That means that, again, we'll use the 13 million. If I gift away $10 million during my life, and then I have another $4 million that I have left upon my death, then you've used up the $10 million of exemption. So now you only have $3 million of exemption left.
Right, because otherwise people will be on their deathbed giving away as much as they can at a lower tax threshold so their loved ones have more in their pocket after they pass. Makes sense. To avoid that happening. It's
kind of like an anti-avoidance type of thing.
Of course.
They don't want everybody to just give away everything, and then they can avoid the tax completely.
Okay, I currently am working on a case where a person is in the US on an F1 visa and they want to start a business. They're getting an MBA and they're really interested in buying a franchise, and their uncle wants to gift them the sufficient funds to cover the what's called the investment funds, or the initial investment, in order to qualify for an investor visa. And so this all is interesting because one is residing in the US temporarily, the other one lives abroad. I'm not sure what the mechanisms of that are, but they should probably be aware that there could be a tax that's applied to this too for a gift, correct?
Yes, and especially this is where the immigration piece of this comes into play. And so
Right.
often, as in our conversations, we talk about, and we start talking about taxes, and we talk about immigration, and we talk about immigration and start talking about taxes or estate planning.
Mhm.
And this is just another area where your immigration status has a whole lot of effect on what your tax consequences are going to be.
Right.
So
Fascinating. I think
primarily, and this is like a huge difference. So like I just told you, right now, we have an estate tax exemption of 13 million. And it's either 13 million or 6 million. Anyway, it's a lot. Like most people aren't going to be in that bucket, even if it's 6 million. But
right.
if you are, and just to be clear, what that is looking at is your worldwide assets. So it's not just your assets in the US, it's assets wherever you own them.
Oh, well, that was my question 3A that I had written on the side, is that question. So that's really important, and that sort of goes hand in hand with the tendencies we've seen in the past 10 plus years with the FBAR and all these different requirements where you have to report your foreign assets and foreign income and everything else, even when you're residing in the US, even if you're a green card holder, right?
Exactly. And that gift that we were talking about, that's if you receive it, if you receive a gift, you have to report that. So that's
There's nothing Christmassy or holiday or birthday-esque about this. Everyone's paying extra for being generous, it sounds like.
it's not, no, it's not a very cheerful topic.
Well, you anticipated my next question, which was, how do you and your family members know if you'll have to pay the estate taxes when a loved one passes away? And then I guess that has to do with that threshold and how much already has been gifted and doing that calculation. And I guess those numbers will shift too if the number goes from 13 to 6. I'm guessing you're gonna have some very interesting cases where people might have gifted more than 6 but less than 13, and then I don't know what would happen in that scenario.
Yeah. And actually they already addressed that issue of they're not going to
Okay.
claw that back. So you're
That
not
would
going
be
to,
really unfair.
yeah, but you're still going to have used up all of your exemption. The other thing I want to make sure that
Yeah,
we
that's
we
true.
touch on, because this is really important, is that when I'm talking about like your immigration status makes a lot of difference in terms of what how this tax affects you, is that for the exemption for the US person, and this US person means you are a US citizen or you basically have a permanent home here for purposes of the estate tax. And
Okay.
you're taxed on your worldwide assets. But again, you have that exemption. So we'll say it's $6 million. You have that exemption, and only if it goes with your worldwide assets plus your life insurance, I should add that in because often that can push you over, exceed that exemption, you're going to have taxes. If you are not a US person, meaning you are not a US citizen and you are not your permanent home isn't the US,
Does that mean,
then
Shannon, LPR, legal permanent resident status? Is that the bright line? Is that sort of the cutoff? If you're an LPR or US citizen, then automatically this applies to you, or is it not that? Is it not that black or white?
it's not that black and white. And that's
Okay.
where a lot of times we see confusion between, because
Yeah.
for the income tax test, that it is a black and white, it is a bright line.
Yes.
Either you're a resident or you're not, as long
Right.
as they count the days, and if you're
Physical presence test, right?
excuse me.
The physical presence test.
Yes, physical presence test, substantial presence test, I think it is too.
Right. So that's what really governs here, not if you are a green card holder or not, per se.
So that does not govern here. So that applies to income taxes, but it does not apply to estate taxes or gift taxes. And the test here is whether where you live is you have the intention of staying there with no definite plans to leave.
Okay. Don't you love those subjective legal standards that can be abused by anybody?
Yeah,
Or
yeah, it
interpret it in
definitely,
whatever way they feel like.
yeah, it can be either like really confusing or it can be opportunities for planning, right? Because, okay, we
Yes,
can
that's why people need us, Shannon, you and I, for these gray area situations.
yes, exactly. And I mean, this whole area, it's not a DIY kind of thing, right? As you
Oh,
can
goodness, no, not unless you
so
want to do it DIW, do it wrong, and then you're in trouble.
yes, and I've seen it unfortunately many times. But I want to so if you are not so if you're a US person, like
Yeah,
I said, like you're living here and planning to stay here.
yeah,
Mostly, and if you're or if you're a US citizen, US citizen, you're always going to be a US person. If you have a green card, most likely you're going to be a US person because that requires that you plan to stay here.
yes.
Then
Yeah.
we have sort of some gray areas where it's H-1B visa. Maybe you plan to stay here, maybe you don't. There's a couple other types of visas.
Yeah, the L1 also, those dual intent, those are called dual intent visas, and those are also kind of gray area as well. So it's better for the purposes of getting a green card, but it's that inferred intent to make the US your permanent residence is the same. I guess that's where it overlaps. Yeah.
Yeah, so those were really looking at facts and circumstances. But if you're here on a visa that requires you to go back, then you can't be planning to stay here, then you're likely not going to be considered a resident for US estate tax purposes. And that means you're not subject to estate tax on your worldwide assets, but you are subject still to estate taxes on your US based assets. And the key here is that your exemption in that case is not $6 million. It's not $12 million. It's $60,000.
What?
Yes.
That's 0.005% or something of the amounts we're already talking about. That's enough barely to live on if you're living unless you're living in South Dakota or something. So
You can't buy a parking space in New York City for sure. For that
exactly.
So if you have brokerage
Okay.
accounts here, if you have any real estate for sure here, then those things are going to be subject to, if you are not a US citizen, they still will be subject to estate tax, and you will only have that $60,000 exemption.
And we see this more often than we'd like with our clients that overlap too, is people come here, even if they come here with a temporary intention, they may stay for 5 or 10 years, but then they don't move back to their home country because they pass away for whatever reason. And then this is what happens if they haven't planned accordingly. So that actually,
and even a lot of times people will be move here for a few years or so, and they'll say, oh, I'm going to buy real estate here. It's a great investment. And I can have it for when I come and visit or when I come here on business. And they buy a condo in New York City or in Miami or wherever. And then they don't really think anything of it in terms of, okay, this is a great investment, not realizing that half of it can kind of end up going to the government if something happens to you and you pass away.
Unbelievable. And that's exactly what I was going to ask you about. How do we practice prevention for our clients? So what are some of the things that they can do to avoid or reduce these estate taxes or their exposure to them?
So if you're a US resident, then there's types of irrevocable trust that we can put in place. A lot of times we'll put life insurance in an irrevocable trust to get it out of your estate. But there are also other types of strategies that we can use. There's a trade-off generally in terms of this planning between taxes and control. And so the tax planning is not generally simple. And then there can have a lot of questions as to how much do you want to give up in terms of the control. So there are a lot of strategies, but it is complex state tax planning. So you need to kind of get in the weeds with that. And then in terms of if you're not a US person, the biggest thing is just be really careful about how you're holding your assets. So where are they based? I mean, is it a good idea to open a brokerage account here? If you do, don't hold US stocks, don't hold certain bonds. So there are certain types of, you have to, you want to look asset by asset as to whether it's considered a US asset. So you can hold in a brokerage account here foreign stocks, and that's not going to be counted as a US asset. But so you want to be really careful. And our investments industry is investment services here, financial services is really robust. And so we attract a lot of capital from other countries that just, it's a lot cheaper. It's just a lot more efficient in terms of the services and the options that you have. But you have to be really careful in terms of ending up with some bad tax consequences.
Yeah, and you know, to be honest with you, the one thing I love about our podcast, and every time we have interactions where we speak about the law, I'm always learning something new. And this $60,000 threshold that you mentioned, there really is a dividing line here. And if you're on one side, which is the non-resident versus resident, it's a huge gap. And I think that people who are here temporarily on those visas that are not designed to, you know, eventually become permanent resident status platforms, I don't think they ever really think about this. So I'm very grateful that you're opening a lot of eyes, because I think that's extremely important for people. Even if they're thinking I'll be here for 3 years or 5 years, if they're going to accumulate any assets or buy a property or try to feel more at home and work with people locally, like investment brokers, then they really need to look out for this.
Absolutely. And so even for if you are investing in the markets here, make sure you work with somebody a financial advisor who is really familiar and has expertise in this area, because I've just seen too many that they'll just go and online even or calling up, and won't name the financial institutions, but some of them will just open that account for you and not tell you that there's going to be a huge issue with this if you pass away.
Of course, so we see that all the time. They're thinking about themselves and not like we do, looking out for the long-term, you know, well-being of their clients, and that's so. Yeah,
you have to be really careful. And then in terms of if you're going to buy real estate here, sometimes I'll have clients who their family wants to help them buy real estate, maybe put the parent on the deed, and that you just have to be really careful of unless we have a really good treaty with that country. There's ways that you can plan around it, but they're cumbersome, you know, and they're expensive. So you can do a revocable trust, you can do different types of corporations, but the most important thing is just talk to somebody, talk to a professional before you open a brokerage account, definitely before you purchase any real estate here. You just want to make sure before you do any gifting, you just want to make sure that you get the advice before you take the action.
The same theme pops up in the same take-home lesson in all our podcasts. Do not improvise.
Yeah, because once that, you can't unring that bell, you know, once the money is transferred, it's really hard to, you know, and the gift has been made and they've already done the transaction.
They give me a do-over.
So hard to unwind that transaction. So definitely kind of that a common refrain that we have of get the advice before you take action. It can save you a whole lot of trouble and headache and money.
Shannon, thanks for enlightening us and the viewers on all this. It's hugely important. And I always enjoy our talks. Looking forward to the next one.
Me too. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you.